What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and today we are having a discussion with David. Is your last name pronounced Mirsch?
Correct.
Mirsch. Good. I'm so bad at pronouncing last names. But today we're talking with David Mirsch about the historicity of Jesus. And, we've had pretty good conversation over email, and we wanted to set up something where we could talk and have it recorded and everything. So, David, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, like who you are, what you do, and all that kind of stuff?
Well, actually, I'm fully retired. I'm 70. I guess the best definition for this purpose would be amateur historian. I've kind of focused my research on the Gospels and specifically more or less the synoptics. My goal has been to kind of get to the truth of whether there's a historical Jesus or not. And just so people know, I don't really have an agenda as far as religion is concerned. I'm not a theist and I'm not an atheist, which may seem strange, but I think humans that try to figure out whether there is a God are kind of missing the boat. That neither side is really going to be able to answer that. They both share the same idea, and that is belief through faith. They don't really have any concrete proof of God's existence one way or another. So my agenda is strictly, what was going on, what are the Gospels about, and can they be relied upon to basically send along the historical message. And, I leave this to last because I don't want to be a promoter, but I did write a book about it called The Open Tomb that kind of summarizes the things that I discovered while I was doing the research. And I've been working on this for at least more than 15 years. Kind of started when I was 12, and two big influences were surprisingly, what's the name? Well, when Jesus is on the cross and somebody rushes up and gives him a sip of the soaked sponge, and then he almost immediately either passes out or dies. And I thought that was very coincidental that happened. So that's kind of what has driven my desire to find out more of what was going on. So that's it in a nutshell.
Okay. Now, the open tomb, do you like, as far as that goes, like that's not like concerned with trying to prove that Jesus resurrected or anything, is it like that's not the focus of that? Sorry. Sorry about that.
No,
that's not the focus of that book, is it?
It absolutely is about that. I'm a big believer in the Swoon theory, and the choice that I made pretty early on from reading the Gospels was that it was an engineered swoon. In other words, it wasn't just a natural swoon that he went out, kind of on his own, but that sponge held on a hyssop branch being put to his lips was the game plan, that he was supposed to appear dead, but he wasn't really dead. So that's kind of the main focus. In fact, the subtitle to the book is Why and How Jesus Faked His Death and Resurrection.
Oh, okay. All right. Cool. Well, today we're here talking about the historicity of Jesus. So I'm kind of curious as to what you think is the best evidence that Jesus actually did exist, like as a person.
Well, to do that, we kind of have to deconstruct what scholarly consensus believes. In other words, most of what you see and read from scholars involved in this kind of research, I find is incorrect, that they don't really understand what the Gospels are about. And consequently, that misdirects their research to places where it was never intended to go. So I take a totally different view and I come up with a totally different Jesus. So that Jesus strikes me as very historical, but what you're going to hear today is going to be so different from what you've heard in the past that it may be hard for people to really get a hold of it. Let me ask you 3 quick questions. My understanding of the scholarly consensus is that Jesus died on the cross. That's pretty much everybody's view. Yes? No?
Well, I think that most New Testament scholars say that is one thing that we can know about Jesus, is that he died on the cross, or at least that he was crucified in some kind of fashion.
Yeah. And the other thing is that the consensus is generally that the Gospels are unreliable historically. Would you say that's true?
I would agree with that. Are you talking about like what I think, or what I think the consensus is?
What you think the consensus is?
Okay. Well, I think that the consensus is that the Gospels are not representative of history. That you can possibly pull out some historical nuggets from them, but on the whole, they're not representative of like something that historically happened as they depicted it.
Right. Okay. And that's pretty much, the results that I've come up with, which makes it a little, hard to understand how they view Jesus as dying on the cross, because that information pretty much comes from the Gospels. And so if you don't find them historically reliable, except like you just said, kind of, pick certain things out, how do they come to that consensus instead of having a broader view that, maybe he didn't die on the cross? The most probable result for me was that even though he was crucified, he survived the cross, and being seen post-crucifixion led to a lot of confusion. Now, Jesus prefaced that by telling his disciples, I'll rise in 3 days. Well, that's pretty much what magicians do when they're going to perform a trick. They set something in your mind to look for or see or whatever, and then they pull off their stunt. And the stunt here with Jesus was called, and is still used today by magicians, the empty box trick. So look up the empty box trick, and then you understand, when you read the Gospels, when you read the Synoptics, you can understand that it was a planned event, that he was taken down from the cross and put into a tomb, but he was cleaned up in the tomb and revived, and then immediately taken out of the tomb, and the tomb was closed and sealed. That's pretty much what the Gospels, indicate happened to me. The idea, that's a more plausible answer to why people viewed Jesus as being resurrected. At least some people did. Not everybody did, but close followers and what have you. And if you look at it, when he was taken into the tomb, he would have been taken into the tomb by, 4 to 6 people that had carried him from the tomb. Maybe 2 or 3 went actually into the tomb, but it took place at a distance from witnesses, and it took place when it was almost dark. So they redressed him, they cut his hair, they cut his beard, they cleaned him up, they revived him from the drugs he'd been given. And then he was ushered out again of the tomb, and then the tomb was sealed. So that when the tomb ever was opened, or, people looked into the tomb, it was empty. He was already gone out of there immediately. But there are some little things that go along with, it's going to be hard to compress, all of this stuff. Go ahead, John. You look like it was.
I mean, I think that the swoon theory is more likely than like magical resurrection, obviously. But I guess I'm just I'm wondering what evidence is there that Jesus was even crucified, like on earth and everything. Because like, for instance, one problem I kind of foresee with this is that this doesn't explain Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 with the Pauline Creed, because in there, Paul seems to indicate that he only knows about Jesus's death and burial and resurrection from the scriptures. And so, I fully accept that that could be true and Jesus still have existed and had died in some kind of way. Like, I think that, Paul could be reading the scriptures in a certain way. So I guess it doesn't really pose too much of a problem for it, but I'm just kind of curious, like, if there was this conspiracy to get Jesus to appear to be risen afterwards, why is it that we don't have any actual references to anybody physically seeing Jesus on earth? It's only through revelations and through an interpretation of scripture that we see later people attesting to Jesus.
Well, we do have some records that scholars have conveniently overlooked for whatever their reasons are. I was going to respond to something you said in there, and now I forgot what it was.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to gish gallop or anything.
Come on, go ahead. I would rather hear you rebut my comments during this conversation than adding to it later. You know what I'm saying? Just go ahead, and if that's perfect, because that gives me something to bounce off of you. When I said that you're going to see a different Jesus, you're really going to see a different Jesus. The non-biblical or extra-biblical remarks about Jesus. The first one that I came across was Jesus ben Ananias in Josephus. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you're familiar with that passage or not, but Josephus talks about him and describes him exactly as Jesus. Ananias is the long version of the name Annas, which is the high priest in the Gospels. So Jesus ben Ananias is Jesus a descendant of Ananias. That would make Ananias Jesus's maternal grandfather. Okay?
Okay.
Jesus in that passage hides his identity for the first 4 years that he shows up. He shows up in 62 when James is killed. James was the head of the Jerusalem church. He gets killed or dies, whatever way you want to go with that. And Jesus shows up in Jerusalem. But for the next 4 years until the breakout of the revolt in 66, he doesn't communicate or get close to any of the citizens of Jerusalem. Now, you have to ask yourself, why is Jesus ben Ananias, or more specifically, why is Josephus putting that in that passage? Because Jesus ben Ananias was still wanted by the Romans. He escaped crucifixion. And that meant that if the Romans knew that he was around, they'd grab him and re-crucify him. So until the war broke out, when it no longer mattered what the Romans thought about him because the war was on, he kept his distance from the citizens of Jerusalem. He hid his identity. Now, he speaks exactly like Jesus. Woe to Jerusalem, woe to the four winds, all things that Jesus kind of said or implied. This Jesus in Josephus is saying the same stuff. He's described as kind of a country bumpkin, which is kind of the way he is in the Gospels. He's, from the country, he's from Galilee, blah, 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 blah. You need to read that thing carefully and look at it, objectively and say, could this be Jesus? Now, the one thing that Josephus could have included in that passage was Jesus ben Ananias' age. If he had included his age, that would have been a definitive proof one way or another whether he was talking about the gospel Jesus. Okay.
Well, yeah. I'm not sure if that would be definitive proof. I mean, I think that you could possibly add it to your collection of facts, but and it would definitely coincide with the hypothesis that you're putting forward. But I don't see how his age could solidly prove that it's a Jesus that was crucified, but swooned out of dying?
Well, because in my scenario, the Jesus ben Ananias would be in his mid 70s. Now, if Josephus had said, this guy is 36, that would have kind of blown that up. You know what I'm saying? There's no way that the gospel Jesus could have been 36 and 62. The timing wouldn't have been right.
Right.
So that's what I meant by that. It's like that would have changed my attitude towards that passage, but that age limit is not in there, and everything else points to the gospel Jesus. Now, if this Jesus ben Ananias is actually the maternal grandson of the gospel Annas, that means that Joseph Caiaphas, who is the son-in-law of Annas, is Jesus's father. Okay? It's going to be hard to wrap your head around, but that's the way it works out. Annas had a son-in-law named Joseph Caiaphas, and so if Jesus is the maternal grandson of Annas, then the next logical conclusion would be that Caiaphas was his father. Now, in the Gospels, and I only took a few things out of the Gospels to keep away from any question of, circular reasoning. But in the Gospels, both Jesus and his father are called tectones, builders. Okay, that's the same term that Josephus uses to describe the specially trained priests that built the temple. One of the words he used to describe those guys was tectones. So when you see that, then you have to step back as a historian and say, I need to reevaluate what the Gospels are telling me. I need to say, is there a possibility that Joseph and Jesus could have been specially trained priests that worked on the temple? Now, the other thing is that there is a ossuary that's been discovered called the Miriam ossuary. And I want to get this right, so hang on. The etching on it, which describes who's in the ossuary, goes something like this: Miriam, daughter of Yeshua, son of Caiaphas, priests of Maaziah from Beth Imri. So apparently somebody named Caiaphas had a son named Jesus. So that kind of goes along with what I'm saying. Now, historians, and this drives me crazy, historians will frequently say, well, Jesus was a common name. Joseph was a very common name too, blah, blah, blah. That's an observation. That's not a refutation of what I'm saying. In other words, that's not proof that what I'm saying is wrong. That's just, oh, hey, we've observed that there's a lot of Jesuses and a lot of Josephs around. Okay, that's fine. But when you see that kind of family line drawn up in Josephus and on an ossuary, you have to start to think, okay, what more does that mean as far as the Gospels are concerned? Now, I'm trying to get to your point as quickly as possible because I know you want to hear definitive answers about crucifixion and stuff, but I'm trying to present a historical Jesus at the same time, which makes sense then that the crucifixion.
I get you. But so one problem that I have is I have an issue just discerning, I guess, between your hypothesis centering around Jesus ben Ananias and the hypothesis that Jesus ben Ananias served as a sort of story skeletal structure in which the gospel authors modeled some of Jesus's story off of. And that's how Jesus Ananias is connected to like the gospel stories about Jesus. So basically Jesus ben Ananias came along and people knew about what happened to him and everything like that. Josephus records the information about him, but the gospel authors, also knowing this information about him, decided to rework his story into a sort of skeletal version for the Jesus story. And there's a lot of points of commonality between this Jesus ben Ananias and the gospel story of Jesus. But I feel like it's a bit more parsimonious to view it in that more linear fashion of Jesus ben Ananias came, he did all the things that or whatever happened to him. And then like gospel authors used his story as a skeletal framework. Josephus reports what happened to Jesus ben Ananias, and that's how we can identify these things, as opposed to what I feel like is a bit more speculative of a hypothesis, in that it feels like there's an assumption that this Jesus ben Ananias, due to his name, is connected to the Jesus that was supposedly crucified on the cross. And then that Jesus is evidence that the Jesus from the cross lived on, and this Jesus ben Ananias is Jesus that was known as the Christ. I feel like that there's a lot more speculation going on in that particular hypothesis as opposed to my hypothesis.
Where do you say? Where do you say the gospel? Not where, but when do you say the gospels were written? Because that's kind of the premise.
I generally hold to, I guess, the consensus view of that, meaning that the gospels were written sometime between, I think the earliest is like 65, but more likely it was written after 70 CE, and then the Matthew comes after Mark. Luke comes after Matthew, and then John is most likely sometime in the 2nd century.
Yeah. My research has indicated that they were probably written in the mid to late 30s. And there are compounding pieces of data that tend to confirm that. I know most scholars are going to, blow that right out of the water. And, the consensus is what you were saying. But they're concurrent with what Jesus was trying to accomplish. And so when I was going to talk to you, I had this whole thing laid out. I'm going to start with early dating and then get into but I didn't want to leave you hanging on what you wanted to hear. But there are, at least 8 different references to why they were written in the 30s. And some of them may have been written in the mid-20s. If you look at the Gadarene demoniac story, and you have to understand context, first of all. When Jesus was born and grew up, Rome occupied, Judea, the Middle East, Palestine, whatever you want to call it back then. And because he was a devout Mosaean follower of the Torah, he wanted them out of there. Okay. When he got older, I believe that he started a revolutionary movement. And it started probably in 24. And the reason I come to that is I believe he was born in 6 BCE. And the Gadarene demoniac is an allegorical story about the forced populating of the city of Tiberias, which was built by Antipas and was dedicated to the emperor Tiberius. If you read that carefully, you understand. And I listened to all the scholars and stuff, and there's remarkable similarities to Homer in that story. And I just listened to Dr. Miller, I think his name was, and he was saying mimesis was the way that ancient works were written, that everybody was copying everybody. And if you wanted your works to be read, they had to be familiar enough to whoever your audience was that they would actually pick them up and read them. So using Homer as a mimesis was pretty typical throughout. Even Philo did it. snuck things off of other writers and stuff. So the Gadarene demoniac is almost word for word a copy of Homer. The difference is that it actually relates to a historical incident. Jesus was incensed that Antipas, the city of Tiberias, was built on an ancient cemetery. Okay, that made it ritually unclean for Jews to live there. And so after he had built the city and partially populated with Gentiles and other, groups, he still needed Jews. Antipas still needed Jews to live there. So he forced Jews to live in a contaminated situation, and they were not happy about that. They were guarded by the Roman 10th Fretensis Legion to keep them living there. Okay, this is all historical stuff. This isn't me making anything up. The allegory in the Gadarene demoniac story and the Gesserine demoniac story is that basically this demoniac is chained in a cemetery. He's forced to live in a cemetery, just like the Jews are being forced to live in Tiberias. And when Jesus comes along, Jesus asks him, "Who are you?" And he says, "My name is Legion," a Roman legion. That's the connection. Jesus frees him from that, and out of this guy come a herd of swine. Well, the mascot for the 10th Legion was a wild boar. That was on their battle flags. So the allegory is recounting what Jesus wants to do. He wants to kick the Romans out so that the Jews in Tiberias don't have to be contaminated anymore. And the herd of swine, which were unclean animals to the Jews, obviously connect to, the 10th Legion. They all run down this slope and drown in, the Sea of Galilee. That's what Jesus planned to do. That's what that allegorical story is about. That's why it's in the Gospels. So to me, that's another sign that, yes, there was a real, historical person. Jesus would have been 30 in 24. That's shortly after Tiberias, the city, would have been completed. It was started in 19, would have been finished a few years later. That's when this takes place, I think. There are other. So, go ahead.
Sorry. Well, I was just gonna say. I feel like. That's a. that's a fine hypothesis, but I feel like the connections that are being made are a bit speculative. In that it just kind of seems like you have to assume that it's an allegory, and assume these sort of allegorical connections to different things without there being like, some kind of textual indication, like, elsewhere, that would indicate that, Jews typically wrote like this, as far as, referring to Romans in this way, referring to being forced to be in a cemetery or being forced to be in a town in the same way, or something like that. I'm not an expert on this at all, right? But I feel like that there would be definitely some textual evidence somewhere that
there's in Josephus. He's the one that talks about Tiberias, the city, and Jews being forced to live there. That's the textual evidence. That's what you're looking for, is the textual historical evidence. So that event of forcing Jews to live above an old cemetery, an ancient cemetery, is from Josephus.
So the Jews, I haven't read that section of Josephus, but what it seems like is that Josephus is reporting that as like a historical event that did happen, and but you're hypothesizing that this appearing in the Gospels is supposed to be an allegory for Jesus wanting to drive the Romans out. And I feel like there's not a connection to actually lead you in the direction of allegory for that.
Well, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to reiterate that I guess I've heard, I don't know if maybe you're getting to it, but I've heard things that require the assumption that Jesus existed in order for them to happen, but I haven't actually heard any evidence yet that Jesus did in fact exist. Like there was any particular evidence that actually establishes his existence.
Well, if you're expecting a birth certificate, forget it. It's not going to happen. What history, reconstructing history is about hypotheticals. It's about building a story out of known facts that you can kind of put a picture together of who he was, what was happening. Again, you have to go back to contextual situations and say to yourself, if he was a rebel leader, there is no way that anything historical would be written about him. It would all be allegorical, because if the Romans got a hold of it, they would know who he was if it was written. You're not going to put his address in there. You're not going to put his family in there without hiding their true identities. And that's why you see two different Jesuses. You see the one in the Gospels, which is, he's from Galilee, he's poor, he's a poor carpenter, and this, that, and the other thing. And what I'm saying is that no, he came from a very wealthy family, well-to-do family. He was a priest. That's been hidden so that he and his family were protected. Now, if you think that there would be a coincidence involved in the fact that the three most influential men in his life were all named Jesus, or Joseph rather, that's pretty long odds. His father was Joseph. Joseph Caiaphas was, the one who apparently condemned him to crucifixion. And Joseph of Arimathea was the one that gave him a tomb. They're all the same guy. They're all the same man. This is how they hid their reality. So if you're looking for something in, historical records, and the other thing too is that you got to remember that if he escaped crucifixion, the Romans would have declared what we call damnatio memoriae on him. They would have obliterated his memory because they didn't want common citizens realizing that anybody could get away with crucifixion, that there was some way that this particular person faked his death and resurrection. And that kind of decree of wiping out his memory meant that if you held on to any written works about him or spoke his name, you were liable for the death penalty. So a lot of stuff, what scholars don't ask, they're always saying, and I see this in a lot of works. I see it in Carrier and I see it in other people too. Why wasn't anything written about this? Well, the bigger question, the more important question is, who would have wanted to preserve any of the writings about this? The Romans wouldn't. The Jews wouldn't, because they didn't like Jesus. They thought he was problematic. They didn't want to write, and they had a real prohibition against slander. So they had to be super careful in what they wrote about people, because otherwise that was a full-blown sin for them to write something that might not have been true. And if they didn't have the truth, they didn't write about it. And the only people that would have wanted to preserve anything of his are the followers. And that's why we have some of the Gospels. Now, that to me seems like a really obvious question to ask. Who would have wanted to preserve any written documents? But besides that, we don't even know how much ancient writings there were at the time of Jesus. We don't know what percentage of them we still have. We have no way of knowing. For example, Pilate was a prefect for a decade or more. We don't have any writings of his official business. Over 10 years of time, we don't have any writings of his official business. And he wasn't as controversial as Jesus was. So to me, the idea is that there could have been writings about Jesus. We didn't get them. They didn't get handed down over the years. What we got were the Gospels. Those were protected by his followers. So, again, mythicists don't look at that. They say, why isn't there writings about this? When the bigger question is, why should there be? We don't know what we've lost over 2,000 years.
Well, right. I mean, I understand that, but I think the reason why, I think the reason why most people would focus on having some kind of evidence is that while we don't know like what kind of writings did exist or what kind of information did exist at the time, it doesn't really benefit us to speculate about it. Like we can speculate about any kind of information being written down, but the fact that we don't have it means that we can't analyze it and we can't scrutinize what it says to see what sources it came from, if it came from primary sources or if it was just whole cloth made up. So
you understand that the mythicist position is all speculation. There is nothing written down that says, hey, we're going to make a myth about this guy dying and rising.
So there's a difference between
all speculation, John.
Well, no, so there's a difference between speculation and evidentially supported hypotheses,
which is what I'm presenting. Which is exactly what I'm presenting.
I feel like your hypothesis is more built on speculation rather than evidence. Whereas a mythicist,
it's built on an ossuary. It's built on some things in the Gospels that could be taken out. I'm a believer that you can see the Gospels as historical if you understand that they're allegorical, that they're political propaganda. They're not meant to be history. They're meant to be political propaganda. You can pull things out of that and say, yeah, I see that. I understand that that's what it was going on. You're kind of putting a false dichotomy in here. Your side of the argument is that the speculation on mythicism is okay, but the speculation that I'm providing, even though it's from historical accounts, is too much speculation or wrong speculation. And that's not the case.
So by speculation, I mean a hypothesis or a claim that's unsupported by evidence. And so like in mythicism, you have claims about like the Jewish religion, about Christianity, but they're all backed up with evidence that exists.
What evidence?
And, well, it depends on which claim that you're asking about.
Pick one. Pick one. Pick a question, and what's the evidence? Because all of that is speculation. Again, Josephus didn't write anything about a myth of Jesus.
Okay. So what? Hold on.
None of the historians that we have from that time period wrote about a mythic person. Nobody.
We don't have to find anybody writing about a mythic person. But I mean, I feel like Second Peter, I believe it's Second Peter, it specifically has in there where they're saying we did not believe in cleverly devised myths. So I mean, there is that in the not in the Gospels, but in the New Testament. But we don't expect to find direct writings that are like, hey, Jesus was always a myth. But I mean, if you're saying that mythicism is a purely speculative position. Could you maybe you pick out one particular claim that you feel is speculative and that mythicism makes?
No, I think you're missing my point. All of historical reconstruction is speculative to a point. There is, especially after 2,000 years, you can speculate. And this is, if speculation wasn't a part of every PhD's or scholar's research, we would have one answer about who Jesus was. but we have numerous positions on who Jesus might have been. Okay, each one of those is speculation. Now, if you want to toss all of those out, then by all means, toss me out too. That's the point of historical reconstruction. You speculate, you theorize, you put together, maybe disparate pieces of information that you come across, and you try to build a picture just like you try to build a puzzle. And the most probable answer is the one that should win out. Okay? The most probable answer is the one that makes the most sense. Okay? And people should be able
to... the evidence that we have.
Well, or speculation. Like I said, every PhD I've listened to or read on this subject speculates. They don't come up with proof. They come up with evidence that they speculate means a certain thing. Okay? Even, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, they do speculate about things, and they're very clear when they are proposing these modal type of arguments for something as a possibility, or even arguing for a plausibility of it. But normally what comes with it is like supporting evidence that they argue leads them in that direction as being the most parsimonious. Given the evidence that we have. And they typically will explain like why it makes sense of the evidence that we have. But I feel like with your hypothesis about the legion of pigs and everything, I feel like that's built off of a speculation that doesn't have any supporting evidence that leads us in the direction to think that it's allegorical. Like on my view, as far as the exorcism of the pigs goes, the Old Testament predicts that the Messiah is supposed to be God's final prophet. All the prophets of the Old Testament do these magical things. One of the things would be to cast out and control demons. And so being that the Messiah is supposed to do that, this is just one story that's been told that fulfills that. And I feel like that has support as far as the Old Testament goes. It has explanatory power in that it can explain how the story came about and make sense of the Jewish understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be. And then it being parsimonious, I feel like there's not really something that's left unanswered as far as that goes. But my question for your hypothesis is what's leading you in the direction that this was, allegorical, and that it was crafted as an allegory to represent like a real historical thing. Let me ask you this. Does Josephus record a single person that drove out the Romans, or at least attempted to drive out the Romans from that city of Tiberias that you were talking about?
No. But okay. Like I said, my historical evidence that was the basis for the allegory is Josephus talking about the city of Tiberias being built on an ancient cemetery, having to be guarded by the 10th Legion. And then in the allegory, the demon says his name is Legion. Now, to me, and he's chained in a cemetery. So, yeah, there's some supposition there, but there is a historical Josephus, episode that is there that makes that, okay, kind of clear that that's what this allegory is about. And again, as you look through the Gospels, what you're going to see is allegory after allegory after allegory, because Jesus and his followers are trying to send a message out to the public that this is what's going on. And there doesn't need to be in Josephus an historical event where somebody tried to drive the 10th Legion out of Tiberias. The allegory is about what Jesus plans to do. Okay, I can pick another, allegorical story if you want to show you that it runs through the Gospels, but from the sound of things, it's a false dichotomy. I mean,
I don't think that it's a false dichotomy. I find it hard unless somebody wrote down what Jesus said. I don't see how we can make a judgment as to what Jesus was planning.
Yeah, I don't even know how to answer that, John. I'll be honest with you. It's like, what? Again, you're a military leader. Do you honestly think that he's going to put out written works that say what he's going to do? That's why it's an allegory. That's why it's what he wants to do. That's what he wants to communicate to the population.
So
the audience, you're missing the context. You can't have Gospels being absolutely factual in the face of Roman occupation. You just can't. It doesn't work.
Well, so what we do have evidence of, though, later is Josephus writing about the Egyptian who was proclaimed to be a military messiah that was supposed to drive the Romans out of Jerusalem. And of course, he failed and everything like that. But I mean, we don't see any kind of like need to cover up his plans or anything like that. And they're attested to by Josephus later. So, I mean, I guess it seems a bit like a special pleading argument to say, oh, well, Jesus needed this allegory, needed his plan to be hidden. But all of these other military messiahs that have come and gone, they did not. And so I guess I just don't see why Jesus is the special case.
Because you don't have any Gospels from those other military leaders. What you have is Gospels relating to Jesus that have been preserved to us. If you had Gospels from the Egyptian, that would make your argument a lot stronger, but there aren't. Okay. We don't know if there ever were, but what we do know is we have Gospels that have an allegorical story that relates to a historical event. Okay. That's why there's a difference. Now, let's go in. Do you want to go into something else?
well, I mean, maybe we can get back to like what can you state one particular piece of evidence that shows that Jesus existed like in history that's
yes, but it's from the Gospels. Okay. The fact that it is written in the Gospels that he sweated blood and that when he was poked with a spear, watery blood came out of him. Okay. I don't know. And you may know more than me on this because you know more about the actual mythicist side of things than I do. That to me indicates that that actually happened, that he sweated blood and watery blood came out of his spear wound. Now, if it was just about Jesus, I would say, hey, look, somebody's making that up to make it look, more dramatic or whatever. The point that makes it more telling is that in the story of Asenath, which I say is his mother and father getting together, Asenath sweats blood as well. So if Asenath is a metaphor for Mary and Mary sweats blood, that means that there's either a theological connection between Asenath and Jesus, or there is a genetic link between Mary and Jesus, that they both sweat blood. Now, is there any kind of medical situation that would account for that? Yes. Years ago, I spoke with the nation's leading hematologist, and he said those are classic signs. Those are symptoms of a genetic disorder called G6PD, or more familiarly, favism, because it can be triggered by eating the fava bean for some reason. And it's usually handed down between mother and son. And it is very prevalent in the Middle East among the Jewish population. In fact, it's called the Jewish disease. So to me, that means that that story of him sweating blood and leaking watery blood out of a wound actually happened, that his mother suffered the same genetic disorder and passed it on to her son. And that to me would not be something that would be written in a myth. That is something you'd have to write two myths about two different people, probably at two slightly different times. You'd have to write it about Asenath, and then you'd have to write the same situation about Jesus. So to me, that's kind of a strong indicator that, yeah, he was a real person and he had this disorder.
So given that this disorder seems to have been known to the Jews, which I haven't done any research on either the disorder, the prevalence of it, when the disorder popped up, like if it's all like, I don't know when the first recorded case of it happening is or anything like that, but let's just assume that's a possibility for the first century. How would you discern between somebody just making it up, making this up because they know about the disorder disproportionately affecting Jewish people, and it actually happening, like Jesus being a real person and having that particular disorder?
Well, then you've got to have, like I said already, then you'd have to have that same person making that up in two different stories about two different people, probably from two different, slightly different time periods, not much, but slightly different time periods. You'd have to have the same author for both of those. Nobody claims that. Nobody says that the story of Asenath was written by a gospel author, or that the language is the same, or, there's any kind of contextual similarity between the writings. They're two separate writings, two separate authors.
As far as, like, I don't know who Asenath is and why you're connecting Asenath to Jesus's mother.
Well, I can tell you, Asenath is a theophoric. It's a name that incorporates the name of a deity. And in Asenath, the deity's name is Neith or Neth. That was the Egyptian goddess who was known as the Virgin Mother Goddess. So, because she could get pregnant without having intercourse. Okay, this is all historical stuff. I'm not making this stuff up. You can look it up. As the story is told, there are descriptions in there that very closely tie her to Joseph. They wind up getting married. It ties her to a description of the Jerusalem temple. And there's one funny little point in there that is a mistake that she makes. And that is that when her father is talking to her about Joseph, she says, "Oh, the man that was deserted by his father." Well, in the Old Testament, Joseph isn't deserted by his father. He's deserted by his brothers. So that mistake there has a meaning. And the meaning is this: when Josephus introduces Joseph Caiaphas, he says Joseph called Caiaphas. He doesn't say Joseph ben Caiaphas or Joseph ben anybody. He says Joseph called Caiaphas, which means possibly that Joseph doesn't have a connection to his father. And that's why she says that. It's a little little teaser of what the story is actually about. Now, all of the characters in the Asenath, Joseph and Asenath story are basically about Joseph in Egypt, but they all relate to people in Jerusalem. In other words, King Herod is there, Archelaus, his son, is there, Joseph and Mary are there. The story gives an idea of what the slaughter of the innocents was all about. And it's about Archelaus wanting to marry Asenath, or Mary, because she's the daughter of a high priest. And in the story, and I know this is tough to follow because it's, not easy to go through it like this. In the story, the son of the Pharaoh sets up to kill Joseph and his two sons. That's where I think the story of the slaughter of the innocents comes from, is that Archelaus wanted to kill Joseph and his two sons so that Mary would be free to marry him. There are plenty of other connections to Mary, but the main one is really, she's named Asenath for a reason.
Well, I believe that the slaughter of the innocents takes place in Matthew. Is that right?
The slaughter of the innocents? Yes, I think so.
Yeah. And I believe in Matthew, Jesus is figured as the new Moses. And so he's basically given a similar backstory that Moses has. And
right.
Moses, the Pharaoh called to kill all of the young Jewish children.
Right.
And that's why he was placed in a basket and put down the river and everything. So, I mean, I feel like that's a stronger connection than the connection you're trying to make.
Well, I would suggest that you read up on Asenath to get the long version. There's two basic versions out, an abbreviated version and the long version. It's really hard to discount the fact that she sweats blood when under duress. That is not somehow connected to Jesus. Two first century persons who both sweat blood. I find that very difficult to work. You have to look at some of this stuff and go, okay, maybe that seems like a connection. And then when you look at the whole story and you look at her mistake about Joseph in the Asenath story, that he was deserted by his father when he wasn't, but Caiaphas was. I think what you don't understand is that, and again, it goes back to mimesis. It was typical, and especially in the Jewish community, to tie in current events with past events because they wanted that continuity. That was very important to all of their stuff. All of their theological stuff had a long lifespan. So Jesus showing up as a new Moses is not surprising. The temple is built to replicate the tabernacle in Sinai. And the Mount of Olives is meant to replicate Mount Sinai. That's how strongly the Jews felt about connecting current events with past events. They mimicked it all the way. And they used Greek and Egyptian and Roman writings in their works too, to make it palatable to their audiences. This is not something I'm cooking up. This is well known by other scholars. So when you say to me, well, that sounds more like this, that, and the other, well, yeah, it absolutely does, because that's what they intended. That was their goal.
So like, why I'm convinced of McDonald's hypothesis that there's a lot of links between the Gospels, specifically Luke, and like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. They have a lot of textual dependencies like between the two
Right.
and everything. And so we see that, but also it's important to know that those that were writing the Gospels were trained in these pagan schools where they were taught to read the Iliad and Odyssey and to use those as like the framework for creating new stories. And so all of those things factor into the mimesis argument, like surrounding the Gospels and everything. And I just don't see the same connection here for the allegories that you're discussing.
Well,
And I'm just not convinced by it.
Well, except that there's two rationales behind what you just said. Everything that you just said could be true and could be used allegorically on historical events. It doesn't just have to be a mythic story. It can be used the same way that you're talking about. Writers were taught, in Greek philosophy and Greek writing and all that kind of stuff, and they utilized that when they wrote the Gospels about historical events. Okay? Now, let me give you another outside extra biblical response about the virgin birth. Okay?
Okay.
And this is another thing that points to the historicity of what was going on. If you look at the Babylonian Talmud, Haggiga 14b to 15a, you'll see a story about Ben Zoma. And Ben Zoma is in a discussion with other sages. And he is talking, and this comes at a time when Ben Zoma was politically active and the Bar Kokhba revolt was just about to start. And many of the early followers of Jesus, early Christians, were leaving the Jews because they didn't want to be involved. They didn't feel that many stayed, but some few left. And Ben Zoma is actually kind of needling them in this account because he talks about a high priest, and high priests were obligated to marry virgins. Okay. And at Jesus' time, that was for priests and high priests. And he's talking about the ability of this woman that is with this high priest to get pregnant without intercourse. And comically, he suggests that, well, if the high priest ejaculated in a tub of water that they were both sharing, that his ejaculate could have impregnated her. What Ben Zoma is trying to do there is he's pretty much sticking it to the Christians, because there was obviously, and had followed them for a long time, comments about Jesus' father as a high priest getting Mary pregnant before they were married. And so that's why the virgin birth story was kind of introduced into the Gospels to cover that. And it was like, yeah, plenty of other famous people, some of the, Caesars and stuff like that. Some of the other mythical people, they were impregnated, without intercourse or by God specifically. We'll just cover it by throwing that in there. But Ben Zoma, was making fun of that situation. To me, that's another pointer that, most scholars don't connect that because they don't connect Jesus' father to being a high priest. Once you do that, that story makes a lot more sense. If you think Jesus' father is just a poor carpenter, that story makes no sense. But if you understand that he was a high priest, then you get it. That's why Ben Zoma is saying that. Again, confirmation that, like the sweating blood, those things they're not mythical. These are stories that were told.
Maybe they were stories that were told, but I don't think that they represent like anything that happened in history. So it kind of seems like your hypothesis about the virgin birth hinges on assuming that Jesus's father was this high priest and that they would want to cover up getting Mary pregnant prior to their marriage. I mean, I don't know how you would actually ground that like in reality and move it beyond the, unsupported speculation sort of way. I find that it's much more parsimonious to consider the virgin birth as a product of combining Hellenistic religious ideas with Judaism and the Jewish aversion to sex, and sex, especially concerned with the Messiah or the Savior who's supposed to save everybody from sin. I find that looking at it in that context, it makes a whole lot more sense than to, speculate about who Jesus's parents actually were, like their vocations and things. It seems a bit more parsimonious with the culture and the area that they're in what was going on in Christianity at the time, how they had been integrating these pagan religious ideas into the Jewish faith for years before they invented the virgin birth for their savior, which seems to be more which seems to make the Jesus story more palpable to those that would be coming from religions that include virgin births, like, the Roman pantheon and other pagan religions. So, I mean, that I think that it's more parsimonious to view it in that context than it is to view it in your particular context. But I mean, that's just what convinces me. I'm wondering, maybe we can pivot a little bit. Is there anything about the mythicist hypothesis that you feel is either incorrect or strained, like beyond Jesus didn't exist as a historical person? Is there any specific thing that the mythicist hypothesis states that you feel is particularly unsupported or a strained interpretation?
Yeah, I've already mentioned one, and that is that, especially in Carrier's work, that the assumption automatically is that why weren't things written about Jesus? And he says, I can't remember, I could turn around and find it if I needed to. But he says at one point, if all this is true about Jesus, why wasn't anybody writing about it? Well, we've already covered that. There are reasons why nobody, preserved those things, or that they may have been written but have been lost. But that's not his argument is not a sound enough argument to bother with. It's like, okay,
I don't recall. Well, sorry for interrupting. I don't recall Carrier actually making an argument based on that. I mean, I think that there is a strong argument from silence that nobody wrote about Jesus, in the first century. I think that that's a strong argument from silence, but as far as making the argument or using that as like an argument that proves Jesus was mythical or didn't exist, I don't recall Carrier doing that exactly. It's one particular thing that factors into the larger case. And it's specifically the stronger argument from silence that, nobody wrote about this figure that supposedly, did a lot of stuff. Like, and we're not just talking about like favorable Christian writings or anything like that. Like, we don't have any Roman writings about any kind of, rebel leader that was rousing the Jews in the ways that Jesus is supposedly rousing them. We don't have any Roman records about Jesus being crucified. We don't have any records at all about anything that Jesus did in his life. And even his most devout followers after his supposed death and resurrection they don't really write about anything that actually occurred like in his life. Like I'm thinking of Paul as like our earliest writing. I know that you disagree about the Gospels dating, but
Yeah.
Paul's writing doesn't have anything about Jesus's life here on earth in it. So it kind of, I feel like that's a strong argument from silence that can be made. So I don't find that to be weak at all, that specific version of the argument.
Okay, let's cover Paul real quickly. Paul starts out, he's a Roman citizen for a start. That's made clear. He admits that he persecutes early followers of Jesus. Then he has this mysterious vision of Jesus, and then suddenly he switches to supposedly following Jesus. Okay. You can't walk that into a court of law and say that that actually happened. You just can't. Nobody should believe that. No scholar should take that as a reason for Paul being a follower of Jesus. No one. Anybody that's got a brain in their head should look at that and go, no, sorry, he was persecuting them, and then he has this mysterious vision, and then all of a sudden he's on there. No, what he's doing and what he started out to do as an agent of Rome and of the temple, the Jerusalem temple, was to try to get rid of a rebel faction that was in their midst. He tried by persecution. That didn't work. So he switched sides, and then he told a totally different story about Jesus and his mission. So all the celestial stuff in Paul and all of the fact that he didn't anchor it in a historical person is his attempt to hijack the mission, hijack the story. It's very clear. He's doing it with an agenda in mind. I'm going to subvert what Jesus is talking about by selling a different message. And this would have happened after Jesus was off the political stage. Okay, Jesus would have been gone. He would have been in hiding. He would have disappeared. And he could not rebut anything that Paul was saying. So Paul told a different story. He even went to a Latin name. He was Saul, then he goes to Paul. That should be a real clue to people that this guy is working for Rome. He's not a Jew anymore. He's not worried about the Jews. He's trying to subvert the message. This is what people don't get. It's astounding to me that scholars would base work on Paul's vision, that it's legitimate, that it actually had an impact on this guy, and that he couldn't have been lying, and therefore what he's writing must be based on his visions and his revelations. It's like, really?
Well, I mean, if you're going to assume Paul was lying, why not assume that Paul was lying, that he was ever persecuting the Christians in the first place?
Well, you could. Absolutely, you could. I don't have
I guess
I mean, trying to change the message without first saying that he was persecuting him. That would still hold true. That would still, because the message is so different from what Jesus was actually teaching. And did Paul get along with the apostles? No. They had issues.
Well, I mean, yeah, they had some issues on tangential topics, but in Galatians 2,
fundamental topics.
I mean, not on the gospel of Jesus.
Purity, circumcision, Gentiles coming into the group. Yeah, those are fundamental. They're not ancillary.
No, I mean, as far as the gospel of Jesus goes, Paul confirmed his gospel with the other apostles, Peter and James and John. Like in Galatians 2, he says that he came up and he confirmed his gospel with theirs. Now, I'm guessing you would just assume that he's lying about that, maybe.
Could be.
I don't see the fruitfulness in just assuming that Paul is just lying all the time, when Paul is quite literally one of the only pieces of evidences that we have.
Once you point out somebody is lying, doesn't that give you a clue as to everything that comes out of them? It should.
Well, I mean, I think that if you're going to assume that Paul is lying, then there's no way that you can trust anything that Paul says.
Exactly right. In my research, I didn't even bother with Paul once I realized that about the vision. it's complete nonsense. It has nothing to do with what Jesus was trying to accomplish. And the only reason for that is that Paul had a different agenda. He was trying to subvert the message.
To me, if you throw out Paul, you throw out any kind of evidence that you might have for a historical Jesus.
No, that's not true. That's not true at all. You get closer to the historical Jesus because you get rid of the celestial Paul Jesus. You get rid of the myth. And then what you're left with is there must be some comments in here in this history that Jesus was a historical person. Get rid of the myth, which is what Paul created, because he's a liar. And that what you're left with is a possible historical Jesus.
So your hypothesis is that Paul created the myth about a mythical Jesus, and as soon as you throw out Paul, you can know about the historical Jesus.
You can get closer to him. Yeah, absolutely. And once you understand the context of the Gospels as being allegorical stories about historical evidence, then you start to get even closer to him. Okay.
So in the competing hypotheses, I feel like this hypothesis requires far more unsupported speculations than the mythicist hypothesis does, because the mythicist hypothesis uses the evidence that we have in order to build a case.
It doesn't use evidence at all, John. It uses speculation. It uses coincidental stuff. It uses, similarity as evidence.
This right here has no evidence in it.
What, you're talking about this?
Yeah. This has no evidence in it.
It has got speculation. It has got
no. It's got actual evidence in it, but this has no evidence in it. There are no footnotes in here from expert scholars. It's got no footnotes in here from primary source citations. It has
coincidence of almost all the ones that I read were coincidental. Yeah, I agree with that because of this, but none of it had any historical evidence. There's no historical evidence in there. There isn't.
Understand that the entirety of the background information, which is like, a good portion of the book, let's see, there's element 42, like just the background content itself is all based on the textual evidence that we have, like right here, like this amount of the book is background information based on the evidence that we currently have about Judaism and Christianity.
Mm-hmm. One of the mistakes.
This is direct evidence.
One of the mistakes that I think Carrier makes in the book, and many scholars do, is they conflate Jesus with Christianity. None of that is true. Jesus was a Jew. He wasn't interested in Christianity. Paul is the one that started Christianity. He was kind of the foundation stone of Christianity. Jesus was separate from that. So to conflate those two, to look at early Christianity in a search for the historical Jesus, is going down the wrong path. You can't find Jesus going down early Christianity. You just can't. He's not there. He's in the Gospels. The Gospels have been corrupted somewhat in certain places by later Christian writing, by later interpolations. But to conflate Jesus with Christianity is, I think, a mistake. It's a huge mistake.
I'm not trying to conflate it, like I guess the historical Jesus with with Christianity. I think the only way that we can really know, like, if there was a Jesus at the heart of like what became Christianity, I think that you would need to be able to describe that historical figure in some kind of way. And I don't know how else you would describe a character like that. Like how would you describe the character of Jesus?
Well, I already have. He was a rebel leader. He was a priest. he and his father disagreed with the temple laws.
Right.
He had, stories written about him again in Allegory to hide the true meaning of the stories. This is who this guy was. That he was known enough to Josephus for Josephus to write about him.
Well, Josephus didn't write about Jesus.
He did as Jesus ben Ananias.
Oh, that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, he
wrote about, and I will tell you this, I'm a firm believer, and I think there is enough evidence to prove this, not prove, but support it. And that is that Jesus was partly responsible for the Samaritan uprising. Josephus wrote about that, but he didn't name the leaders. Now, I'm guessing that Josephus probably knew the names of the leaders, but didn't write it because of the Romans. He didn't include the name of the leaders of that uprising, but he knew who they were. I doubt that he would have written about that without full knowledge of what had happened, and full knowledge would have meant knowing who the leaders were. Now, if you look at the Samaritan woman story, you'll see that there's a connection between the Samaritan woman at the well story and the Samaritan uprising. The woman at the well is at Jacob's well. That's the best known well in Samaria. Okay? She recognizes Jesus as a Jew, not as a Galilean, but as a Jew. She calls him, why would you, a Judean, want me, a Samaritan woman, to get you water? Jesus is fully aware of the political situation in Samaria through her 5 husbands. Those are the 5 most recent leaders of Samaria. Okay? And he talks to her about trying to get her and the Samaritans to come over to the Judean side of things. The reason that it's couched in the well, because Jacob's well is right below Mount Gerizim. And it's also right next to a little town called Tirathaba. Now, that name of that town, that village where this is taking place, is actually a Hebrew phrase that means, well, it's pronounced Tirat Haba'at, and it means the place of the choice. And it goes back politically to when the northern Davidic kingdom split up. That was the choice that was being made there. The tribes decided to go their own way and break up the kingdom. What Jesus is trying to do is to convince the Samaritans to rejoin so that they can reestablish that kingdom. That kingdom had the covenant with God. If they can restore the kingdom, not a kingdom in heaven, but on earth, Davidic kingdom, then Jesus supposes that he will get divine help to win the war against the Romans. That takes that to the Samaritan uprising. It happens on Mount Gerizim, right where the Samaritan woman at the well story takes place. There's a connection there.
Okay.
The whole point of the mythicist theory, just like any other theory, is connecting dots. That's what mythicists do. And so what I'm doing is just connecting different dots. I'm not doing anything differently than they do. So you are on one side, you're convinced that mythicism is the way to go. And my point of view is completely different. I think there's a lot of history there, a lot of historical evidence there.
Right. But my hang up is, as far as the differences between both of our positions, is that, mythicism, while we are connecting dots together and forming an argument that has substantial evidence behind it, I feel like your argument has a lot more unsupported speculative claims. And versus the claims that are made on the mythicist side are derived from the evidence that we have. And I feel like you're taking some evidence that we have and then you're layering on top of it this explanation, but there's no connection like to the evidence other than, you know, however you explain it, connecting to the evidence. But I don't think that it actually does. Like, I don't see the evidence supporting your hypothesis. And so to me, it just comes across like it has way more assumptions that are attached to it than mythicism does, as far as explaining the evidence that we have.
Well, you know, that's understandable that you have that view, because if the Gospels were written allegorically with the mimesis of earlier, you know, Homeric stories and what have you, you would draw that conclusion. I mean, that's understandable. I'm not surprised by that. The other things that I'm talking about dismiss it because I get rid of Paul. You know, I have Josephus writing about Jesus ben Ananias. I have an ossuary that says that Caiaphas had a son named Jesus. I have the tectone thing that says, you know, Josephus says that these were priests that worked on the temple. To me, those are direct correlations. If you don't want to believe that, that's okay. But I understand why you're believing what you believe, because you've assumed to begin with. See, I started my research long before I knew mythicism. I kind of think that you started a lot of your stuff with mythicism. And you were already plugged into that idea and maybe weren't quite as objective as you needed to be as you went through that. I don't know. But I'm saying to you that, yes, I get it. You could take your point of view very easily by saying, you know, yeah, these stories. First of all, you know, the consensus is deal with the miracles. Why isn't anything written about the miracles? Well, they're not miracles. They're metaphors. If he heals somebody that's blind, what he's saying is, this person that I told what was going to happen or what we needed to do couldn't see it. Or this person that I, you know, was deaf that I healed, they didn't even bother to hear it. Or this person that was lame couldn't take action, wouldn't move in the direction that I needed them to move until I cured them.
So first of all, I don't really appreciate the speculation about how I investigated this question. Because, I mean, obviously you don't know me, and I mean, I don't know you, so I'm not going to speculate.
I said, I'm guessing. I said,
I understand that, but do you understand how you, I guess, guessing that I sort of stuck my head in the sand and only looked at like what confirms mythicism? I feel like that's really poisoning the well in our conversation here.
Well,
like,
I'm sorry. That way. I am. I'm sorry that you feel that way. And that was not my intention. My intention.
That's not a real apology. I mean,
oh, yeah, John, I'm very sorry.
No, I mean, you're sorry I feel that way. You're not sorry for making speculative claims about how I investigated this question. You're sorry that I feel like you're poisoning the well in our conversation here, which has been perfectly fine up until this point, I feel. I just don't like the insinuation that, you know, I've somehow only confirmed my bias in this, because in actuality, and it, you know, if you had just simply asked me, you know, to start with, how I came to become a mythicist, I was a historicist. Like I thought that Jesus existed, and then I went looking for the evidence, trying to find evidence for Jesus's existence, and that's when I stumbled upon the entire debate, and I became convinced of the mythicist side due to the preponderance of evidence pointing in that direction. That's how I came to my conclusion. So
okay.
It's not the way that you're perceiving it here. Now, to get on to the point that you continued on to make, the miracle claims, I feel, is better supported by Randall Helms in Gospel Fictions, where he makes textual connections between the miracle stories in the New Testament to the miracle stories of the Old Testament. And so what that ends up being is that the New Testament authors took the Old Testament stories and reworked them into these miracle stories about Jesus, because, and here's the motive, Jesus was a prophet that was supposed to do miracles. And if Jesus never really did miracles, if nobody saw him do miracles, nobody wrote about him doing miracles, how would you know what miracles he did? Oh, let's read the Old Testament, which is supported by Paul stating that he read the Old Testament, and other Jews at the time that were reading the Old Testament in order to know things about the Messiah. The New Testament authors, they read the Old Testament, saw other prophets doing the exact same miracles. And since Jesus is supposed to be the final prophet, Jesus was going to do all of those miracles, but they were going to be bigger and more spectacular and all this other stuff. That seems far more parsimonious than coming up with this hypothesis that all of these are allegories, and that when Jesus heals somebody that's deaf, that somehow means that these people weren't listening to me, and I guess he convinced them to listen or something like that. Like, I feel like my explanation's far more parsimonious with the evidence that we have than the allegorical interpretation.
And again, I will say to you that that's understandable. I get it, but you're missing the context of the work. And
how do you explain the connections to the Old Testament then?
I agree with you. I agree that they were used. I agree that Homer was used. I agree that these things were used. Absolutely, they were used. Okay. That doesn't refute the idea that they were used to present historical situations. You are taking it to be mythical. I'm saying, no, those were used, absolutely, because that's what the audience for the Gospels expected. They expected that kind of writing. They wanted the Iliad. They wanted those stories. They wanted a hero. I've talked about the continuity between the OT and the New Testament, that the culture of the time was all about, finding things in current events that, precluded, Old Testament stories. So I'm agreeing with a lot of what you're saying. I'm just saying, I believe that doesn't have anything detrimental to what I'm proposing.
If the motive of the gospel authors is to represent Jesus as a prophet of God and the final prophet of God, and that's the reason why they fabricated miracle stories, that means that there's no reason to layer on top of that this allegorical understanding of these miracles as being messages about Jesus making people see something or making people hear something or doing whatever these allegories are supposed to do. It makes that unnecessary.
No, I'm not sure how you're reaching that conclusion. It is a way to present who Jesus is historically in Jewish culture. It's a way to connect him to past heroes of Jewish culture. It is a way to convince the audience or support them in their beliefs that everything that happens now is somehow related to what has happened in the past. And as far as Paul getting his information from Revelation and Scripture, if as I say, the Gospels, were written before Paul, then the Scriptures are the Gospels that he's talking about. All Scriptures means is writings. It doesn't mean OT writings. It just means these are writings that I'm getting the story of Jesus from, Revelation and these writings. And if the Gospels were already written before Paul's time, that's probably what he's talking about. So in a large part, I actually agree with you, John, that what you're saying, yeah, absolutely. I don't have a problem with that. The difference between you and I is that I see that as a cultural milieu of, what was expected back then. And every culture did it. The Romans took, Greek gods and converted them and renamed them, but basically they were the same gods. They took Egyptian gods and reworked those gods. They wrote like Homer did. They learned how to write, from learning Greek and how those works were done. And then they incorporated that stuff into the Gospels. And it was just normal and natural. Jesus doesn't perform any miracle. He doesn't reattach a missing limb. He doesn't move a mountain. All of this stuff can be looked at as metaphor. He doesn't replace, a missing eye. He sticks a cut off ear back on somebody's head. We don't know what happened to it, but there's no major miracle there. He doesn't part the waters like Moses. These are all metaphors.
But I mean, he's still the seas.
That's okay. But I'm saying that, from my point of view, it makes much more sense that if you're trying to promote politically a movement and the expectation is that this Messiah is going to be able to do this, that, and the other thing, then you leech off of that Old Testament stuff. You incorporate it into the writings about a historical Jesus, because that's what political propaganda does. It promotes a leader and an idea, and it's time sensitive. So propaganda is only valuable during the lifetime of the leader or the lifetime of the movement. Now, when he supposedly resurrected and nothing happened, that the Jews didn't jump up and go to war with the Romans, that political movement died. There was no support for it. There was not enough support for it. So I don't have a problem with, believing that this is all myth. I can see where you get that from. I just don't see why you can't look at that and go, well, yeah, those are just metaphors. And this is political propaganda. And that's what political propaganda does. It embellishes, it basically promotes a person. And in this case, they had the guidebook. They had the Old Testament. If you're his father and you guys want to make a change in Judaism, you want to get the Romans out of there, what do? You go to the Old Testament and look. You look at all that stuff, you incorporate it to make Jesus look like the next Messiah.
So I acknowledge the possibility of all of this, being true. But as far as weighing like the evidence for each position, I feel like the mythicist position has far more evidence than this allegorical hypothesis does.
Well, sorry, I thought you were done.
Well, I was just going to say that I still feel like there's a lot of assumptions that are being made that are not resolved with evidence. And whereas mythicism, let's just assume that there might be some assumptions in the hypothesis, I feel like it still has far less assumptions than the allegorical thing does. Because like you have to assume that Paul was lying. We don't know that Paul was lying. You have to assume that. You have to assume that Jesus's father was a high priest. You have to assume, like I could go down the list of all the things that you have to assume. You have to assume that the Gospels were written in the 20s. You have to assume that Paul was trying to subvert the Christian message, not Christian message, sorry, the Jesus's message. That you have so many things that if we had evidence for, it would be a strong case. But I just don't see the evidence, because you can't solve an assumption by making more assumptions. That just compounds the problem that already exists.
Everything that you just said can be flipped over to mythicism. You have to make the assumption that Paul is telling the truth. That's an assumption.
I don't have to make the assumption that Paul's telling the truth. I mean, I fully acknowledge that Paul definitely got his information from somebody, not necessarily Jesus. And we don't know who that was, but all we have to work with is what Paul tells us. And Paul tells us that he got his information from Revelation and Scripture. Those are the two places that he says.
Yeah.
without him explicitly telling us who he got his information from. Outside of that, it's not fruitful for us to speculate about who he got his information from.
Really? Okay. Well, that's an interesting point of view for sure, because the whole point of research is to speculate on where somebody gets their information. You said it to me.
Yeah.
Where is the historic? You don't have enough historical stuff. Okay. Paul was teaching something totally different from Jesus's message, but you don't think we can say that he was a liar. He has this mysterious vision that changes his point of view. He changes his name from Saul to Paul. He's a Roman citizen. He is connected to the Herodians and the temple, but you think he's supportive of Jesus somehow. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because it's wildly speculative that he could have this vision and that it would change his point of view. To me, if you can't, like you just said, we can't speculate about where, Paul got his information, then you throw him out. You just throw all of his stuff out. You just say, if we can't name where he got his information other than Revelation and Scripture, about information about Jesus, you throw him out. You just have to.
I don't think so, because
witness.
No, I don't think so, because if we can find scriptural support for things that Paul says, like Paul says that he does, then I mean, he very well could have gotten the information purely from Scripture.
Okay,
I mean,
but as I said, if the Gospels were written before Paul, then you have to say to yourself, what Scripture, what writings is Paul talking about? Is he talking new, Gospel, or is he talking Old Testament? And we don't know. There's no way to determine.
Well, I mean, it wouldn't have been the New Testament, because the New Testament wasn't written. Paul's epistles comprise, a good bit of the New Testament.
Right.
And so, I mean, he's included in the New Testament. So it definitely wasn't the New Testament.
No, but the Gospels, if they were written in the 30s, as I suggest, and there is some evidence to, support that view, then he could easily be talking about Gospels as Scripture, as writings. See, today people have this idea that if you say Scripture, that is somehow holy. But back then it's a word for writings. It's not holy.
I mean, it's writings specifically Jewish writings. I mean, Paul was a Jew before he came to Christ, as it were. So, I mean, Paul's scriptures would have been in the Septuagint. I mean, could there have been some other scriptures that he was using that weren't necessarily in the Septuagint? I mean, sure, there was a lot of Jewish writings that weren't contained in the Septuagint. So, I mean, and we definitely don't have all of the Jewish writings. But the point is that Paul points to scriptures as where he's getting his information from. And so if we can find support in the scriptures that we do have, that would have been known as scriptures in Paul's time, then I feel like it would definitely support this idea that Paul purely got all of his information from scriptures. I mean, he also got it from Revelation too, but I'm just saying that it's like the explanation is parsimonious. Like, it explains the evidence that we have.
If you make the assumption that he's telling the truth. I
don't see the benefit there is in assuming that he's lying.
Huh? I'm sorry?
I don't see the benefit in assuming that he's lying.
And I don't see the benefit in assuming he's telling the truth. He has a vision. He has a vision. Now, most people have looked at visions, most scholars, I think, skeptically to a point. Like the idea that 500 people had a vision of a living Jesus and all that kind of stuff. Well, they've come up with different psychological explanations for that. And, yeah or no, it could have been, it might not have been. When you tell a story about somebody having a vision, and then they go on to preach a story that is not the same as the person that they had the vision about, then to me, they've distorted the story. Now, if you want to say distorted rather than lied, good. I don't have a problem with that. But I wouldn't trust it. And most of his, I don't know the exact number, many of his epistles have been thrown out. Some have been found by scholars to be probably from Paul. So, you know, his works in the New Testament, some are by other people, some maybe by him. If you're different from the mission and the message that was originally being taught by Jesus, then you're not being honest. And that then you don't know anything about what Jesus was trying to accomplish. And the fact that, you know, he says that the apostles accepted him. Yeah, that's like somebody, you know, when a small child comes up to him and says, you know, tells him a whopping story, and they pat him on the back and say, yeah, that's good, go play. That's kind of what I feel that the apostles did with Paul. Yeah, okay. We don't have time for your nonsense, you know. And so Paul took from that they agreed with him. Doesn't mean that they agreed with him. We don't even know if they, you know, that they met or talked. Paul says that they did. You know, Paul is not foundational to any of this. You just can't trust him as a witness, period. If you want to, you know, that's a personal choice. It's subjective. It's not backed by anything. There's no proof to it. There's no strong connection to it in any historical sense. You just blow it off as far as I'm concerned, especially as I seem to have found out that the Gospels were written in the 30s. And there's a reason why they were written in the 30s. Okay, they were expecting God's help. And if you look at most of the major revolutions in that area during the first century, there's a 30-year gap between each one. Judas of Galilee in the 6th, the Samaritan uprising in 36, and the actual revolt in 66. They were anticipating that God, or one of God's agents, as seen as the morning star of Saturn, would rise over the Mount of Olives. And that would happen every 29.4 years, or roughly every 30 years. And they were expecting that was a sign that God was going to help them. And so these revolts started in that time period. There's a reason why these things happened. And Paul makes up this celestial Jesus to divert people. And he diverted a lot of people because it spoke to them of a God that was not going to be violently revolutionary. It was going to be a loving God that would take care of them. And back in those days, that was pretty impressive. That's what people wanted to hear. They didn't want to hear a multiplicity of gods like the other cultures had that were, you know, kind of wacky and did their own thing, and, you know, you couldn't count on them. They wanted to hear about a God that was celestial, that would take care of them, that if you believe this, you know, you got this. And it worked because they didn't have Social Security back then. They had a community that would take care of them, the Christian community. And that was pretty attractive. But it had nothing whatsoever to do with Jesus's movement. And neither did Christianity. It's just, that's not what his goal was. His goal was reestablish the Davidic kingdom, restore the covenant with God, gets God help to help in a coming war, and get the support of the poor, basically the poor people. All your stuff is true.
So you don't think that Jesus considered himself to be the Messiah?
No. Well, did he consider himself the Son of God? There's the Messiah, I don't think, until Christianity came along, I don't think the Jewish Messiah was considered to be the Son of God. He was the chosen one by God, but not necessarily the Son of God. So when Jesus is left behind in Jerusalem in the Gospels, and his family finally finds him after 3 days, he says, where else would you expect to find me but at my Father's basically work or home? He's talking about his father, the priest or the high priest. I think it would have been sacrilegious for him to say he was the Son of God. I think those are later interpretations. I think those are Christian messages. He saw himself as the Messiah ultimately, and he tried to keep it secret because he didn't want the Romans to find him. He didn't want them to know what he was up to.
But I mean, that doesn't mesh with the that doesn't mesh well with the Jewish understanding of what the Messiah was. The Jewish understanding of what the Messiah was a savior that was the Son of God that would come and remove all sin and set up an eternal kingdom in heaven. That was the Jewish expectation for the Messiah. So, I mean, it seems like you're proposing that Jesus saw himself as a Messiah that's antithetical to the concept of a Messiah in Judaism.
Not according to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls imagined two leaders, basically two messiahs. One would be a priest, one would be a king, that would take on the enemies, the sons of darkness, with an army of the sons of light. That was their way of referring to their own army. Okay, so that was grounded, from my understanding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that was grounded in the here and now. The difference between the Essenes and the Zealots were very proactive. They wanted to do things now. The Essenes were more fatalistic. They were going to wait for God to show up. The Zealots were going to take matters into their own hands and start it and get it going. So,
well, yeah, but the Dead Sea Scrolls definitely envisions the Messiah as being a son of God.
I'm sorry?
The Dead Sea Scrolls definitely envisions the Messiah being the Son of God. And yeah, there was a two Messiah idea in there that was probably that obviously predated what eventually turned into the Christian version of the Messiah. But there was still, like, the Messiah was still envisioned as a son of God.
Well, okay, I don't have a problem with that. I still think that there was a very strong group, and it's mentioned in the Gospels that somebody asks him, "Are you the Messiah?" And he said yes. Now, my interpretation of it was that the Messiah was an earthly person. It wasn't necessarily the Son of God. He was anointed. He was chosen by God to fulfill Old Testament, prophecy, all that stuff. When you think that's the case and you've got the playbook right in front of you, the Old Testament, it's pretty easy to duplicate those things and say and write those things in connection with who you are. So, it's a hard argument to say, well, he fell into this thing and he happened to match up. No, he had the playbook. He had the Old Testament. He knew it, and his father knew it. The other thing is that him being a priest explains his knowledge of Torah more so. I find that much easier to accept than him being a poor carpenter in Galilee. Okay, I don't see, and Christians will say, well, because he was a miracle, because he was the Son of God, he had all this knowledge. No, the reality is that the historical Jesus, if he was a priest, would have been well-versed in Torah and could have sat with other, priests and stuff and sages and discussed Torah with them very easily. A poor carpenter from, Galilee, I find that much less likely. I just don't see that. So again, scholarly consensus has gone wrong in numerous things. Okay.
I can agree with that.
Real quickly, Joseph of Arimathea, the consensus is that's a town somewhere. But in actual fact, it's It's a Greek phrase saying basically the one who removes or takes away the gift of God. It's ero matathia. In other words, ero is to take down, to remove, to take away. Matathia is from the Hebrew Matthew or Mattathias, which is the gift of God. Now, Philo tells us that the Romans allowed relatives to remove crucified victims. They didn't say friends or other believers. So you have this kind of awkward situation with Joseph of Arimathea, being explained as, well, he was this and he was that, and the Romans no. Joseph of Arimathea, Joseph, the one who took down Jesus and he was the gift of God, is Joseph's father, or is Jesus's father. He's a relative. He's his father. And it's also interesting because I think the crucifixion took place in 37, not when the consensus is, that both Pilate and Caiaphas lose their positions, and they were the two leading political religious leaders of their time, and they had served the longest of any high priest or any prefect, much beyond anybody else. Both lost their positions in 37. Now, Josephus cooks up a story that Pilate was removed for, crushing the Samaritan revolt. But he was doing his job at that point. You don't get removed by the Romans because you're doing your job. They got removed because the tomb was empty and Jesus went missing. And the Romans weren't particularly happy about that. Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like you would actually have I feel like you would actually have like Roman records like stating that. I mean, they didn't have a problem with
we don't have Roman records, John. We don't have records for Pilate's time in office. We don't. You can say, oh, it should have been this and it should have been that, or it should have been written down. Please, that's complete nonsense. We don't have it. We don't know how much of it there was. We don't know how much could have been lost. We don't have any idea. We have some things, and we have some things that may have been influenced by the Roman damnatio memoriae, where they didn't mention Jesus because of fear of death. These are
but
they did practice that. They did.
My problem is that you can't definitively say that was the reason why he was removed. All the evidence that we have does not say that is the reason why Pilate was removed.
So it doesn't say why Caiaphas was removed.
Huh?
We don't have any historical reference for why Caiaphas was removed.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm not concerned about Caiaphas. I'm just concerned about Pilate. Like, as far as why Pilate was removed, the evidence we have says something different, and you're just speculating about the quote unquote real reason as to why he was removed.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no evidence that suggests that he was removed for the reason that you stated. So, like, I don't see how that's supposed to be convincing to me.
Well, as we started our conversation out a long time ago, it's connecting dots. Okay. You don't get really, do you think the Romans got rid of Pilate because he quashed an uprising, which was his job? Do you honestly think that that's why he was, or could it be possible that Josephus wrote that because he couldn't mention Jesus? And so he had to mention Pilate being removed for that reason, late in 36, according to him, but more like 37 by the time they sent messages back and forth. It just seems to make a lot of sense. And some scholars speculate that Pilate was removed in 37, early in 37. Okay. So
I mean, it's my understanding that Pilate was removed from his position because he had some rather brutal reaction to a religious group that he that he was particularly brutal to, and this was just the last incident in what seemed to have been a lot of problems that Rome had with Pilate as prefect there. So, I mean, I think
that the Samaritan group were armed. Now the Jews said they weren't armed. Josephus indicates that they were armed. Now, then what is Pilate doing? Why would he be there if not to suppress an armed uprising? I don't know. Just doesn't make sense to me. It's not speculation. Okay. It just doesn't make any sense.
All right.
So,
well, I do need to leave to go and get my son. But David, I really appreciate you joining me to talk with me today about both of our competing ideas on this topic. I don't know if you want to tell everybody like where they can find you. Like, I don't know if you have like a YouTube channel or anything like that.
I do, but I don't stay up on it very much. It would be the Open Tomb. But John, I do want to seriously apologize for saying what I said. You're absolutely right. That was probably speculation about how you came to where you are, and it was inappropriate. So
I appreciate the apology.
Yeah, I would hope that we can get together again sometime and continue to hash this stuff out. So
no, I really enjoyed the discussion. I appreciated it.
So did I. I love hearing your views and how you got there and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah,
I think it was good.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, David, for stopping by. I'll try to have a link down in the description for your Open Tomb book. I believe that's a book, right?
Right.
Yeah. I'll have a link down in the description if anybody wants to check that out. And I guess I will see all you heathens later. All right. Don't forget to stand up, use your voice, and all that kind of good stuff. Bye, heathens.